and we are here to talk about our journey with PTA equity in our community of Evanston, Illinois, which is a suburb just north of Chicago, home to Northwestern University. Beautiful lakefront properties, and maybe one of the more diverse communities on the North Shore of Chicago as well. And our story starts around the fall of 2016. At the time, I was a member of the District 65 School Board, which is the local K-8 school board in Evanston. And Biz
I'm an educational equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant, and I was doing a lot of work with the school district and a lot of the parent communities around town.
And as a school board member, I joined the school board primarily because I wanted our community to really confront and start more intentionally dealing with issues of racial inequities in our schools. It had been something that had been given, in my opinion, lip service for a long time, and there were a lot of programs that were put in place to try to, quote unquote, fix Black students. But my lens was we really needed to fix the systems and the structures that were in place, and I know Biz shares that lens. But that's obviously a big thing to tackle, and I am the kind of person who likes to figure out what the discrete project is that maybe we can look towards. And one thing that struck me when I came onto the school board is we have 18 schools in our district. The elementary school that my children went to was on the north side of Evanston, in a wealthier, more affluent part of town. And I had been on the PTA and had noticed things, we were able to fundraise pretty easily for things that, the things that the school needed, particularly things like playground equipment. The year before, we had done a massive fundraising campaign to put a track and sport court in our playground.
It still makes me giggle every time I think
about that. We were able to do that within a year. That was just the kind of community that I live in. But I was noticing as a school board member that those kinds of projects were not happening at schools across the district. And there was a really sharp divide between the north side wealthier schools that could fundraise to do those kinds of projects and schools on the south side who couldn't.
So my children went to one of the schools on the south side that couldn't. And honestly, I didn't even realize it was a thing that they were having less than other folks in Evanston. I just, I think everybody kind of assumes that whatever happens at their school happens at all the schools. And so it wasn't until doing some of my consulting work where I would experience some schools that could hire me for 5 sessions and some schools who couldn't afford to bring me in at all to talk about racial equity and EDI, and that I started to kind of pay a little more attention. And it seems that Suni and I both were complaining, and at some point we must have complained to the same person because we didn't know each other at all, and they said, the two of you should get together and talk.
That's kind of what blows my mind about it, that you and I really didn't know each other at all when we started this.
Our kids didn't have any of the same activities. We were on different ends of town. And so when, again, I wish we could remember who possibly suggested this to us, but we met to talk about, anecdotally, we felt pretty confident that there was a pretty significant financial divide in what PTAs were able to fundraise, but we didn't have the numbers to back it up. We didn't have the clear data. And so we started with just saying, okay, I think we need to gather folks together and see what we find. I think a lot of people think we had a very specific agenda when we started, and I think we had a very clear philosophical agenda. We believed every child should have the same opportunities as any other child in the district, and that particularly as all of our children in our 18 schools go to the same high school, it didn't make sense for there to be that kind of inequity within a system. And so we didn't know exactly how we were going to get there, but we knew that we thought something was amiss and we thought something should be done about it. And so we came together and talked to the folks who ran PTA Council, which is an umbrella organization of all the PTAs at the time, and decided to start trying to get reps from every school to come together to a meeting to just even have a conversation about what was going on.
And I think that was maybe one of the first of many stumbling blocks. I know that I was maybe not entirely surprised, but a little, at that point, I think I was just trying to get people to come to the table and talk. And I tried to be very transparent about it to people. Like, look, if we come together, if we look at the data, if we decide that we're okay with all this and nothing should happen, then okay. Like, this has to be, if this is going to succeed and be something that can be sustainable and move forward, we all have to agree to be a part of it and build it together. But, just even getting people to agree to talk was shockingly difficult. And there was a lot of resistance and people who, went around us trying to, in the case I was on the school board, trying to go to the school board president and the superintendent, sending them emails, trying to get them to stop me from doing
reelected,
it.
right?
I was running for
fired as a
re-election
consultant
at the same time, and there was an active campaign to have me lose my seat. And this was just to try to get people to talk.
Right. I think, with the work that I do, and I taught for a long time at DePaul, and I taught classes on social movement. So I was like intellectually ready for the resistance, since I taught about it in many ways, but I wasn't quite prepared for the manifestations that existed, and and that a lot of people, nobody was willing to say ever we're anti-equity or we don't think we should share our resources or anything that specifically concretely went against what we were trying to do, but they created their own version of whack-a-mole with these false reasons in what the resistance looked like. So then we would have to address that, it's this. Okay, well, here's our response to this. And then they'd be like, well, no, it's not really this, it's this. Okay, and then we'd have to respond. And so I think, I don't think either of us thought it was going to be a short process, but I think the level of patience it required for us to know that, we really wanted to change something substantially. We really wanted something transformative, and we had to bring everyone along if we were going to get something that was sustainable. And so I think each of us took our turns where we were not as patient as we needed to be, and the other one would talk us down and say, hey, let's keep our eyes on the prize at the end here, what we're really trying to accomplish.
Yeah. And I think a key to that, too, bringing people to the table, is knowing that we had to bring people who didn't agree with us to the table. We could have easily just said, we know people at every school who are in favor of equity and would want to do this.
The deck for sure.
But that wasn't going to get us to a model that people were going to accept and that the community would accept. So we had to bring in people who we knew were disagreeing with us, who we knew were sending the emails trying to get us fired or not elected, and find a way to work with them and to get them to trust us. Because that's really what I think is everything about equity work, is building relationships and building trust. And we had so really the first couple of years of the project were building that trust with us, but then also within our committee for each school representative to feel enough trust to share information, because that was the other thing, getting PTAs to share what arguably should be public information anyway, about what they were fundraising and what they were spending the money on. And one of the most impactful meetings that we had at the beginning, in the first year of our process, was literally we just put big sticky Post-it notes up in a wall around the room, and we asked people, bring in your PTA budget from last year, and let's write down the things that you paid for and what kind of events you were able to hold or things you were able to buy, or the quote unquote perks that you were able to give to your students or the staff at the school. And it was a very eye-opening
I remember
experience.
So vividly sitting there, because what we did is we had the item, right, and said, okay, who has a garden, right? And then it went around the room, and every single school that had a garden said they had a garden, right? Whether it was garden, science fair, teachers appreciation events, whatever it looked like. And, being a part of one of the schools that had to say, no, we don't have that, to the round robin over and over and over again. And just watching what a powerful learning experience that was for everyone in the room. Because again, I do think people thought, oh, well, we might vary a little bit in terms of what we've chosen to prioritize, but we're mostly doing all the same stuff. And then being able to see that like the same, 4 or 5 schools were not having 80% of the things that the other schools were having. I think that really was one of our first turning points, right? It wasn't us trying to convince everyone that there was a problem, right? We could just say like, do we think these are things kids should have? And if the answer is yes, then how can we settle with that so many kids don't have it?
Right. Yeah, I think that was definitely one inflection point where we asked the group, okay, now that we know this, do we can just continue on and just let this be the case, or we can do something about it. And unanimously, the entire group was like, yeah, this can't stand. We have to do something about it. I think the other real inflection point for us was the pandemic.
Yeah, obviously there were a lot of incredible challenges that came up with the pandemic, but because we had been doing this work for several years before, and we had already moved people to a point where people felt responsible to try to solve this inequity, and we'd already started doing some of our earlier iterations where, this 10% of this school's budget was going to this school, right? We were doing these kind of redistributions. We had really been pushing on the concept of reserves, right? That a lot of people, some schools were holding more money in reserve than other schools had for their entire budget. And so we had been talking a lot about like, is this appropriate? What is the reason you would use reserves? What's the situation? And then the pandemic hit. And pretty quickly, we were able to convince all of our PTAs that had reserves to give up 75% of their reserves and put it in a pandemic relief fund. And so within 2.5 months, maybe, we distributed $500,000 to families in need, right? Before the government got any of their supports together, we were making sure families were getting fed and people were getting gift cards. And it took kind of a monumental effort with school social workers and principals to make sure the resources were getting to the right folks. But the philosophical work that we had done up to that point made it much easier for us to say, what is the emergency you're saving this money for if it's not now? Right? What would be the explanation to 6 months from now still be sitting on this money while families are suffering? And there were some beautiful demonstrations of what equity is really about. And that one of our schools, I think, put $41,000 into the pot, knowing they were going to get like $6,000 back, right? That like because what was happening with that is the schools who had the families with the greatest need were also the schools with the least resources, and so they couldn't meet the needs to support families during that time. And the schools that had the greatest amount of resources had fewer families that were in need, and so we were able to make the argument then that it just made sense for us to pool all of our resources together and then give to the families that need it, and that we wanted kids to get fed and families to be taken care of more than it mattered which school they were from.
Right.
And once we made that leap, then we were able to push for, well, that should be the philosophy we have for PTA funding in total, right? Why would we, if we understand that this is the better way to solve problems in this instance, then we should move towards having one PTA fund where all the money goes in and then is equitably distributed. And so that, there were lots of hard things about the pandemic, but we will always credit the pandemic for putting the added pressure on that decision making, because folks were kind of wanting to go slowly, and we were kind of 10% and maybe we'd graduate to 20%, and it was going to take us a lot of years to get to the all in.
Yeah, I think that experience really showed everyone the power of the one fund model. We built that infrastructure in place to distribute those funds and get them where they needed to go, such that even other organizations were giving money to the PEP fund, knowing that was going to be an efficient way to get money out to families.
Yeah, like the community foundations and other folks were feeling like they were 2 or 3 steps removed from the actual people who needed resources. So supporting us, because we had the model with social workers and principals, made a lot of sense. So it was a really... I think what we didn't say is when we started all this, we started with the initial push right after the 2016 election, and a lot of people in our community were really struggling with what to do with having someone they oppose so ideologically in the presidency. And so we really encouraged folks that the thing that we might have more control over was local government,
Yeah.
right? And creating local solutions to some of these problems. And so that combination of starting after 2016 and then having the pandemic hit, we were getting there. I think we were already having pretty substantial conversations about going to one fund, and whether it was 6 months from then or a year from then, but that really solidified that, like, of course, this is the direction we should go in. We saw how seamlessly we were able to address that need in a pandemic, which none of us have ever experienced before. And then, what would be the benefit of going back to a model where there was scarcity for some and excess for others? And so I think both of those things outside of our community helped push folks to get on board with what this was.
But Biz, I think we do have to be honest. We're making it sound like it was all easy peasy lemon squeezy after that. And I think that would be doing
a great disservice to anyone trying to do this work.
To all the work we put into it, the people who helped us, push things along. I always joke to people that if you go to the PTA Equity Project's website, you can see our 3,000 pages of FAQs.
We answered all the questions.
And that was the approach we took. Like, every question that somebody asked us, we considered it and we tried to answer it. And
collectively, right? Not you and I tried to answer it, but as a group, okay, what is the solution to this?
And so we started out, I think, with 1 page of FAQs, and over the years, it does feel like it's ballooned into 1,000 pages.
It does. I will give credit to some of the questioners. I think, a lot of people brought questions that we hadn't considered, right? And so I think the process, I think we're going to have a sustainable model. My hope is that we will sustain this forever, because we didn't shut down voices, because we allowed people to bring their fears forward, and that we didn't assume that every question was coming from a hostile place, or I think some of the people who pushed us the hardest were some of our biggest supporters, but they knew they had to go back and sell it to their communities. They knew, as the rep to a school that had a ton of resources, they had to be very clear on the rationale and anticipate all of the reasons. Because again, the resistance to equity doesn't look like I don't like equity. It comes in the form of all of these suggestions or critiques that if you just ignore them, then they get more fuel, right? And then that you have more likelihood that a group is going to gain traction in the resistance. And so, I think probably one of the smartest things we did in the process was we were very clear that, like, while we were the stewards of the process as the founders of it, it wasn't our decision to make. We people got very nervous about us taking their money, and we had to keep reminding them that we don't have access to your budgets, right? We don't have your bank account. So there is no way for us to take money from you that you have not decided to give us. But the fear underneath that, had a lot of things like that emerge, where people felt like we were going to control things or we were going to take things without their consent. And so, it was a lot of helping everybody feel like they had agency in the process. And, I think there was lots of missteps along the way. I think we had to calibrate. At first, we were like, anybody who wants to come kind of represent your school to the meeting, go for it. And then some schools would show up with 6 people, and some people would struggle to have 1. And then that weighted the conversation in favor of the folks that had more representation. And so then we had to be more rigid about, nope, you only get to have 1 rep, and here's how it works. And then once we got through that period, we were like, okay, now if you want to have more than 1 rep, like, I think we were not married to any specific way of operating. We were willing, and I think that made us able to pivot as we needed to make sure that, because we were so focused on the long-term goal, we were not married to any of the specific ways to get there. We were always willing to say, okay, if that's not working, then let's try it this way.
What were some of those questions? I mean, I know you mentioned the money control thing, but what were some of the hardest questions to answer that ended up on that FAQ list?
So, if I can, I think one of the places we hit very early on is that most of people's experience with addressing issues of equity is through a charity model. And we were trying to move people from a charity model to a responsibility model. We didn't want So people would come forth and say, well, we should just have sister schools, right? We'll just adopt this wealthy school, we'll just adopt this poorer school, and we'll teach them how to fundraise. That came up a lot. We'll teach them how to do it. And we had to, like, you can't fundraise from a community that does not have it, right? So there was a lot of belief that, like, the ways that they did things at the schools that had resources were the right ways to do it, and we just needed to teach the folks at the other schools the better ways. And so there was a lot of, I think, things really driven by, we have a philanthropic charity model as a country. We don't have fixing institutions and making them equitable as a way that anybody has seen operate.
And let's just call it what it is. It's, a white saviorism.
For sure, yeah. And so as that white saviorism came up, we had to really try to move people, and I think we were really fortunate that at the same time we were engaged in these conversations, our parent community was engaging in a lot of equity training and a lot of equity work. And so we could use the language that people were developing as common language as ways to help them understand, you've been conditioned to believe that you should always do what's best for your kid, but you have not been conditioned to see the way that that impacts everyone else. And so so the sister schools piece, and then there was also a lot of wanting schools to prove that they were using the money in the right ways. And we had to really push back of, like, look, we either trust PTAs or we don't. We're not coming into your PTA and evaluating whether you're spending money on the right things, right? We are saying the problem isn't that PTAs aren't making ethical decisions or aren't good stewards of resources or aren't the ones that know best what their community needs. The problem is there's no money in the pot. And so we want to solve the money in the pot problem, but we don't want to take away the agency of folks in those schools to make those decisions. So that was we had a lot of resistance around that of, like, well, we want to be able to document and prove that our money's being spent the way we want it to be spent, and helping people understand that, like, once this money is donated, it's not your money anymore, right? Like, once it goes to the pot, then it is up to PTAs to determine. Now, I will say that one wrinkle to that was later, some of similar questions came up that we kind of met with that same frustration that we had initially, that was a little more nuanced than that. It was folks of color who were at highly resourced schools worried that the resources that were going to them in those highly resourced schools were now going to be going elsewhere, and how do we make sure that their kids were not now disadvantaged by this system being in a school that had more resources. And so that we had to take a breath. I think we got defensive and reactive in the fact that we answered 4 million questions in a 5-year period. And so there were times where we thought we understood what the argument was and were ready to kind of give our response to it and have the FAQs ready, and then had to pause and say, oh, this may mean something different. If, like, we need to understand, is this coming from a white parent? Is this coming from a black parent? Is this coming from a parent whose English is a second language? Like, what are the dynamics that might make the question different, and might make the solution different?
And I think that's, you're really bringing up one of the challenges that I think we acknowledged at the start, is that PTAs are largely white-led, white-centered organizations, particularly in our school district. And our committee initially was, because the white parents were the decision makers within PTAs, and that's who we needed at the table to be able to have the authority to share information and be empowered to go back to their PTAs to encourage certain decisions. Our committee was very, very, very white. And we had to acknowledge that. We had, like, this was the only way we were going to get the conversation off the ground. But then once we did have some of the interventions in place, and once we felt like we were in, like, I think I was after the first couple of years, and we were like, okay, we need to start
lots of town halls and a lot of education
town
work.
halls, and again, a lot of us, I think, the two of us, but our committee also collectively, being in the community and building that trust. It's like, this is what we're trying to do. We're not trying to just continue on like a different white savior model. Right. We are actually trying to do something transformative. We were able to start pulling in more representative committee members. But then that had its own challenges because, equity is a very nonlinear and can be a painful journey. And there would be sometimes things that were said in meetings by white parents that then Black parents were feeling like, why am I sitting here? and having to justify that my kids and my needs are worthy. It was really painful, and I think that was something that we had to, as facilitators, had to learn to be more sensitive in creating a safer space for our parents and caregivers of color.
And to recognize as the PTAs became more diverse, the ask was different because for our leaders of color, when they went back to their communities, they got a different resistance than our white leaders when they went back to their communities. And so, I think it was always a conversation for us about even whether we should continue on as leaders. And, I think, in some ways what we engaged in is reparations, right? And that we were very committed to that this system had been unjust for a long time, and that we needed to ensure a more equitable model for the long term, but that there was some labor that needed to be done by the white community to get us there. That it was not fair to ask folks of color to do the labor in their school communities to change all of these conditions that they didn't necessarily have control over, but were certainly impacted by. And so I think that was always a balancing act for us of not wanting to put folks in the line of fire that we couldn't protect or keep safe, but also making sure that we were not operating in a vacuum and that we were hearing from people who were most directly impacted by what we were doing. And I think we could always Monday morning quarterback like where we didn't do it right, or where we were like, oh no, that really worked that way. I think for the two of us starting out as being at two different schools that are very differently resourced, me being white, you being a person of color, like we really tried to think be really intentionally that we were covering a lot of perspectives in what we did. And of course we had to pull in a whole lot of people to help us do the work over the years. I think we always like to say the financial aspects of this would not have happened without Elisabeth Davies, who we pulled in, who figured out all the math of it, because the two of us were never going to get the math done. But, I think that the philosophical pieces, that was kind of our touchstone that we could keep coming back to, because sometimes whatever we came up with as the solution, I'm remembering this now, is like, if a school was on the quote unquote winning side of that, they were on board with that solution. But if they were on maybe the side they thought they were losing something, they wouldn't be on it. Or there were a bunch of schools in the middle that in our first few iterations weren't really impacted. It was the higher schools resources were going to the lower schools, and the middle schools kind of didn't have any skin in the game. And then once the pandemic hit and we were asking everybody to give all their reserves, suddenly schools that hadn't been a challenge for us were starting to be a challenge for us, because now this wasn't theoretical anymore. And so I think that the fact that we were consistent about message, about philosophy the whole time, I think really helped us, and that we really pushed back anytime the white savior stuff came up, right? And that the charity model stuff came up, to say that's not how we think this should get solved. But there was a lot of
a little bit more about the messaging and the values that people sort of were agreeing upon, because in thinking about how will this impact my child versus getting people to see how it could impact the community. I'm curious what the values were that brought people together.
So it was really helpful to us, to think about, we are one high school district, right? And so it isn't that the inequalities that exist in the K through 8 will not impact your kid ever, right? If you go from the most resourced school, you're going to end up in high school where there are kids who have had a vastly different experience than you. And so we really tried to get people to move to this one district, right? It's not one school, it's one district. We're all going into this high school together. So there were multiple levels, right? We wanted you to be on board because we think it's morally right. But if we couldn't get you on board because we thought it was morally right, then we were willing to use other arguments of, in terms of practicality or logistics or whatever it was, to say okay, if we haven't sold you on it's just kind of gross that one school has over $200 per student and another school has $0 per student, that we looking at those Post-it papers around the room, you really think it's okay for some schools to have everything on the list and other schools to just not. We really hammered that hard over and over again. And so then everything that became resistance, that was kind of an offshoot of that. We'd say, okay, let's address the logistical concern you have, or the practical pieces. We got a lot of questions of, we were building a plane while we were flying it. So people wanted to know exact answers of what the results would be, of what their money would be after all of this was decided. But we couldn't possibly give you the exact numbers until we knew whether you were participating, right? So like there was a lot of chicken and egg stuff where we basically had to say like, okay, we need to agree to these frameworks, right? This concept that we do believe there should be one fund, that we do believe that everybody's resources should go into that fund, that we will use a model based on free and reduced lunch population as a way to determine what is equitably distributed, but that you also we have to give ourselves a chance to figure out the rest, right? We don't exactly know how much you're going to be able to keep in reserves. We don't exactly know how much, when the transactions are going to happen during the year, because once we made the vote to go to one fund, we spent the next 6 months answering all those questions, but we had to get people to agree that they would participate. So there was kind of a conditional, like you had to vote that you were in, but you got the 6 months to see what it was really like, and then you had to vote again of whether you were staying in. So it was precarious.
And I think to go back to the messaging question, I think we really leaned into what Evanston claims to be as a community. Evanston on the North Shore of Chicago, we are, District 65, we are the Lighthouse District. That's our logo, has always held itself out to be this model of excellent schools that is, and I think Evanstonians very much feel like, because we vote overwhelmingly Democratic in national and state elections, that we are this progressive community. But when you really look at local policies and when you looked really at what was happening in our schools, and I think this is what drove me to run for school board, is, because I had fallen into that. Yeah, it's Evanston is the,
What
the
folks like to call
loving
ourselves.
term that people like to call Evanston. But, looking deeply at the schools and then seeing, wow, if you look at, test scores, which I know don't always tell the picture, but it's what we have and what we had at the time. Looking at the quote unquote achievement gap, it's like, wow, why are white students doing so much better than black students, and why aren't we doing anything about
Data
it?
is some of the worst in the country.
It really is. Or even just, talking to parents about how they feel about the schools. I was just stunned by how I would hear one narrative from white families and a very different narrative from black families. We had a community that's very divided in how they were experiencing our schools. But that's not the projection that we want to give. And so I think we leaned really heavily into, if we want to be this community, we cannot just keep going on doing business as usual. And again, leveraging the fact that we were all distraught as a community about the presidential election of 2016, I think we tried to make the narrative like, we can't do anything about what's happening in our national politics necessarily, but we can do something about what's happening in our community. Can we fix everything in our community? No, but we can take pieces of it one at a time. And this just felt like something that we could sit down at a table, share some information, brainstorm some ideas, and come up with a solution. And that's exactly what we did. I mean, I don't know that I can think of a better model of grassroots collective action that really, none of this. I mean, I feel like we a little bit jumped ahead, not even really describing what the PTA Equity Fund is, which is a grassroots model of a one fund where all of our parent fundraising through PTAs goes into a single fund that then gets redistributed to schools based on an equitable formula that takes into account free and reduced lunch populations. That we were able to do that. This was not mandated by, I was on the school board. I was a policy committee chair at the time that we started this and eventually became school
Now
board
I'm
president.
on the school board and I'm the policy committee chair.
I
We traded.
could have gone in and said, this is the policy we want to enact and we're going to do it this way and everyone just has to fall in line, but knew that wasn't going to be, people would find ways around it, people would opt out of it. Like it was just never going to work that way.
So that just made me think of, because a lot of the concern that folks had was like, well, what if people do this or what if people do that? And we had to just say, yeah, they're going to try to get around this unless people fundamentally believe this is what's right. So we're not going to spend our time and energy in all of the possible protections that would block the ways that people could manipulate the system. It's easily manipulatable, right? It's all based on your own reporting of what you fundraised. It's all based on you making a bank transaction to put the money in this joint account. So, we felt pretty early on that it was not worth our time to try to make it ironclad as a system that couldn't be manipulated, but that we wanted to convince people that they were doing a disservice to themselves and others to try to manipulate it, right? That if we were so focused on a shared philosophy of why this was important, then people would be less likely to try to violate it. And now, honestly, what is somewhat hilarious to me is that there's more stress in people afraid that they might be violating something they don't know if they're violating than people trying to violate it, right? There is such a shared commitment to this this way of operating that I think more of the confusion or questions now are like, I just want to make sure I'm not screwing it up, right? I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally going around a rule that I don't understand.
But that required a lot of education up front. And that was something that we did through the PEP committee. And we spent a lot of time just talking about what is equity and defining, luckily having you as an equity consultant was a huge boon to us. And you were able to provide free trainings, really, to our group and to other PTA council members who could come in. At the same time, the school district, when one of the most helpful things that somebody told me when I came onto the school board and was like really trying to push for equity trainings for staff, our equity director at the time said, well, none of this is going to work if we don't also train our parent and caregiver community, because they will shut this down so fast if they don't understand and they don't buy into it. So the district then was also providing free trainings into the community. So we really did kind of build this, I hate to use like a military term, but this army of people who fundamentally understood what we were trying to do and fundamentally cared and learned about and were committed to unlearning the things that they thought to be true over time. And I really do credit that. I think there are a lot of things that I don't want to take full credit for things that, that we shouldn't be. But, Evanston is the first community in the country to institute a reparations program. And there, are ups and downs with that. But, I strongly believe that if we hadn't, as a district, through, the work of PEP, like these were all ways that we were chipping away and getting people to understand what equity means. And because you're always going to have your detractors. But what's key is having people who believe in what you're doing as well and who are willing to step up. And so we've had a couple of school board elections since then where there have been anti-equity candidates on the ballot. But again, because we have this cohort of community members who understand and who are sharing the language, they're out there and they can see the coded anti-equity language that these candidates are putting out there. And they step in and like, nope, that's not what we believe in, and are really for like this. I guess what I'm saying is, we started out the PTA Equity Project. We were just trying to kind of solve this one little problem. But I think we also always knew that it was bigger than the one little problem, that we were trying to change people's minds fundamentally on how they looked at schools, how they looked at their community.
Who they saw as their community. Right?
Exactly.
That all of these students in all of these schools are their children.
Right. And that public education is a public good, and that it's not just about getting all you can for your child, your student. It's about making sure that everybody can thrive and be their best. And that doesn't mean taking away anything from your child. It just means making sure everybody has what they need. And that's all equity is. And I think we've been able to, we are no longer the leaders of PEP. That was the other thing. We did our 5-year stint, but it was also important for us to say we need people who can carry this forward. It cannot just be on the strength of our passions that this moves forward. Or stubbornness.
Well, and I think that's part of what's exciting now is that, like, while we were I think we focused on the right things based on our skills at the time that we did. And we were very focused on the funding piece. To watch the ways it's growing and maturing
Yeah.
now, and as the leaders that are in charge, the directions they're going into that you and I would have never pursued,
Right.
but are still like a wonderful component, right? They just had this huge thing called Pep Fest on Saturday with, a bajillion booths, and just the community building aspect of it has really been beautiful to watch as it gets cultivated, right? So the pandemic push really started us with trying to solve problems as a community, but now so many things, it's not a starting point of like, well, I'm going to do this for my school. It's like anybody comes up with an idea and they're like, what other schools want to do this thing? Let's talk about how we can work with vendors together, or whether the plant side sales should be district wide, or what. It's really a significant mind shift. And I think, the scary thing about doing work in education geared towards parent communities is that they're constantly turning over. And so, that you have to be moving folks forward, but always bringing folks along. And I think that that's the tension that we've struck a really wonderful balance with, that is more complicated post-pandemic, because we're just not seeing volunteerism in the same way that we were before. And some of it's great. Some of it is like maybe PTAs were doing things they shouldn't have before and spending a lot of energy on projects that were not the most important. But some of it is concerning as to, like, who's going to coach the softball teams, who's going to coach, right? Who's going to fill in as folks age out to make sure that we can continue this work. And so,
Can you talk a little bit more about the social environments of the students? I'm glad you're bringing it up now because it's so parent-centric, but outside of once all of these kids from all these different schools go to the same high school, how are they interacting with one another in the community in Evanston?
So I think that this is the next chapter of the work, is that I think we've largely changed the lens within our school district, both from board on down. As Suni said, she was on the board, and now I'm on the board. And so, the decision-making at the highest levels are always equity focused and really considering all of these aspects. I think for the students, the participation in things outside of the schools needs some work, right? So while the after-school programs that are at the schools are still functioning in a very equitable way, the things that people pay for outside of that, the sports they play, the classes they take, the dance lessons, whatever that is, those places I think are the next frontier in terms of making sure that that people are having an equitable experience everywhere. And so I think the work in the school district really becomes a wonderful platform for us to engage in. Well, why would we have these other entities creating ways of operating that are not consistent with what they're experiencing all day long in our school system? But it is, it's a challenge because these are small organizations. They're all volunteer. They're often dictated by what people can afford. And even though most of them have scholarships accessible, like, how do people know that they can be a part of these things? And what, does that scholarship really cover, if you're playing hockey, all the hockey equipment, right? All of those things. So I think the other piece that I would say I'm excited about, having 3 kids, 2 in middle school, 1 just going to high school, is that our kids have the language now as well. The curriculum has been really intentional in our district in addition to all of these PTA efforts. And so I think our kids are those first stages of like, we need to be able to notice this and then be able to identify it and then be able to determine that we want to do something about it and then do something about it. Like, I think that the kids themselves are able to like notice, like, I'm doing this activity and there are kids in my school that aren't in this activity, and why is that, right? And what does that look like?
I think too, we mentioned how, PTAs have historically, and not just in Evanston, this is across the country, been very white organizations.
It's a lot of stay-at-home
We
parents.
also know from research that, parent or caregiver engagement in a child's school can significantly impact that child's success in school. And PTAs can be a powerful force to connect that, be a bridge to
When it's working
parent engagement in a school when it's working well. We've not only, the PTA Equity Fund is about the fundraising, but it's also become about so much more. It's about how our PTAs function and who gets to be involved and who is invited, who feels
who's at the
comfortable to be involved. And a lot of our PTAs, I mean, one of the things that they started asking for and what we did was kind of creating some guidelines and some framework of how can we infuse equity, not just into the fundraising portion, but into how our PTAs run, in how we find leadership, and how we run events, in how we build community. And I think we are seeing more families of color coming to PTA events. Certainly PepFest was a wide array of families from all across our communities. And that can only be a powerful and positive motivator for our students. And that's at the end of the day what this is all about, is about how do we center our students and what they need. And, so it started out as something, with a very discrete objective, but I really do believe it's become even bigger than what we had initially thought for it to be. And, I think we've been contacted by PTA leaders and educators from around the country.
Folks writing books and articles.
Yeah, who've heard about us and are like, how did you do this? Can you help us do this? And we always thought, like, could we be a model? Because when we first looked into this, we couldn't find anybody else who was doing this. We thought, well, maybe we can just replicate what's going on somewhere else. It was not happening anywhere else. And so if we can be that model for other school districts, and yes, we're relatively small. There's some things that make Evanston and District 65 unique, but I do think there are some larger themes about how you build community and how you talk about equity that can work anywhere.
Before we wrap up, can I just ask 2 more questions? Mm-hmm. So my first question is, for people who don't know a ton about PTAs, you mentioned the garden, but from a material perspective, like, why is the equitable funding so important to these schools? What are they spending the money on?
Can I jump in on this? Yeah. So PTAs, the parent-teacher organization, the association, if you look at the website and the initial kind of charter for what PTAs are supposed to do, it really was intended to be around community building and advocacy, like kind of bringing parents and teachers together to be an advocacy voice for state legislatures, local policies, that sort of thing. It evolved drastically over the years into being a fundraising vehicle to fill in the gap of where public funding isn't going into public schools. And so this wasn't happening in Evanston because we have specific policy around this. But if you look around the country, there are PTAs who are fundraising for teachers, who are fundraising for facilities, millions of dollars.
We didn't even talk about capital projects. But so what we were finding was that some of our PTAs were fundraising $50,000 to make changes to the building. Right, to your sport court, or different things that other schools,
library additions.
When playground equipment failed, right, and so they had to remove unsafe materials from 3 different schools. 2 schools just didn't have stuff, and 1 school's PTA would fundraise to replace that.
Because again, they were filling in the gap where the public funding couldn't do it, and so that's largely become what PTAs are. Yeah. I think there's an argument to be made that PTAs should not be doing that, and we need to go back to kind of what the original purpose of PTAs were. But that obviously is not going to be a change that happens overnight, and there needs to be a lot of, state level. I mean, just the way we fund public schools in general is very inequitable. Those are bigger problems to solve.
One of the things that we had to figure out, though, was so we have, like, our principals had discretionary funds for certain things, and then our PTAs had funds. So it was the combination that was really making the inequity, right? So field trips, right? So some schools, just everybody can afford to pay for their field trip. And some schools were making $10,000 on a field trip because they would ask for extra money for the kids who can't cover it, while other schools didn't have enough money to send their whole kids on the field trip. So then the principal's discretionary fund was covering those kids' field trip fees. And so then there was less money for the principal to cover other things in the building, right? The way these things all interact together is what makes the disparity so great. And so, yes, it's science fairs and after school activities and gardens and field trips and things, but it's also in a school where there's a ton of need, the principal's discretionary funds is going to buy eyeglasses and make and backpacks and things to cover kids who are, having more significant need. In other schools, it's just adding on and adding on. Maybe they're giving grants to teachers. Maybe they're giving special gift cards or things. So then staff are more interested in working in certain buildings because of the perks that come with that.
Yeah, we had some staff in buildings who were going out of pocket.
Right, to cover things.
Cover supplies, things like that. And others, staff who could just go to the PTA and get money and never had to.
So the impact's immense, and it's at every level within the institution. And so when we looked at it initially, there were lots of ways to try to approach it, but we're like, okay, we have control over what the PTAs are doing with their money. We don't control the district budget, right? And so can we make this as equitable as possible? But a lot of times the questions would be like, well, what about this, or what about that? And we would say those things should also get addressed within the school district or within state funding or whatever it looks like. This is the thing that we have the capital to actually change on our own, and then that will help pressure the other parts of the system.
And I'll say, I know we're like over time, but one area where I think we used our collective advocacy to make a greater public investment from the school district was school supplies, bulk school supplies. That was something that, there would be the supply list and every family was responsible for getting either students, whatever school supplies they needed. Some schools started investigating bulk school supplies to save on costs and also on logistics and, for environmental reasons and whatnot. So for their school, they would do bulk school supplies and parents would just pay in to get that. We kind of started seeing that and again, it was in the committee when we saw that some schools were doing that and some weren't. We're like, really every school should be doing this. And so then we were like, well, is there a way we can do bulk school supplies, but at the district level, but it was still being handled by PTAs? Long story short, school supplies are now funded through the school district. I think there's still part of the parent fee that goes to it,
fee that goes
but
just like
it's
working smarter, right?
It's
18
working
different
smarter,
buildings doing the exact same thing,
right?
Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? We can power our collective,
right? So that's something that we were
together.
Successfully able to get PTAs out of and more appropriately in the hands of the school district. So.
And my last question, just to wrap up, is how do you think doing this work has impacted you as a person?
So I grew up as a Cub fan, which means something very different now for people who have easily got a victory in the last 10 years, right? But for me, that's always come with a level of optimism and believing like things can change and you just have to be patient. And for me, this is like the greatest example of like, it took us 5 years. This was not something we just said, we should change that and fixed it immediately. But like, this is how systemic change works. You get folks that share a vision and you bring more and more people in so that the us and the them get further and further apart and everybody becomes part of the us. And so for me, it's really motivating for, it's why I wanted to join the school board, because I saw the power of working collectively on these things. And it really has shaped how I raise my kids and how I see the world of like everything's possible. It's not always easy. You have to be intentional. You have to be willing to put in the work. We had a lot of hard times as people were not, we weren't the most popular folks in town for a long time. But it was something that could happen and did happen. And I think that that's really important for people to see progress happen, especially when so many things in our world feel out of our reach in terms of changing. Being able to see like, oh, if you can break it down into digestible parts, you can make change happen.
Yeah, I think for me, similarly, it's understanding how systems change works. I think I probably, for most of my life have been more the person of like, I do the research, I kind of figure out what the problem is and how to solve it, and then just convince other people that this is what we need to do. this really challenged my ability to, you have to be willing to hear people. You have to be willing. One of the most impactful things that I ever learned from an equity training is that people don't fear change; they fear loss, and that means understand what are people's fears, what are they afraid of losing, and how can we authentically address that. I think it also enabled me to, understand in an equity journey that there are people who, where is their authentic concern and questions that need to be answered versus like people who are just,
What's distraction and
trying to
resistance?
distract and whatever. So like kind of being able to see that a little bit more clearly has been so, just understanding how to make change, because that's really what this has been about. And, gaining a best friend along the way.
That was a great perk.